So the topic of alcohol in the Caribbean is not a new one. The economic potential of rum as an Atlantic trade good or fodder for pirates and hedonistic planters has received considerable scholarly and popular attention. But alcoholic intoxicants were not just an unthinking escape into luxury or a means to make quick money. Instead, they contributed to the political and financial infrastructure of the colony and aided in the preservation of a society premised on racial slavery. In the aspects of my larger project that investigate the Caribbean, I illustrate alcohol's importance to the political economy of settler colonial society in the Leeward Islands, indigenous Antillean diplomatic and martial cultures, and enslaved and free Africans' experiences of labor on Caribbean plantations. But today, I'm narrowing my focus. Through select intersections and points of divergence raised in the slaying of Governor Daniel Park by a contingent of white elites in 1710 and the 1736 enslaved conspiracy trials, this paper will argue for the importance of alcohol politics in Leeward Islands for both Black and white inhabitants. As the title of the paper suggests, one important facet of alcohol's efficacy as a tool of politics derived from how Leeward Islands inhabitants used it to claim authority over space and their own and others' ability to move through it. White inhabitants attempted to limit the use of alcohol in politics, authority, and creating ties of inter-community connection to themselves, criminalizing Black consumption through a potent combination of legislation, racial ideology, and physical constraint. Black women and men nonetheless built on West African, indigenous, and creolized alcohol practices to construct their own social politics of alcohol, even under the weight of enslavement. There's much to say around this even narrow topic of politics, but I'm going to focus on three main points where I see contests between white and African descended peoples over space, politics, and alcohol consumption, and where these contests are particularly evident. So feasting, communal gatherings, toast and toasting, and alcohol and movement. So first, feasting. Trying to change the slides. Okay. So this is obviously not the Caribbean, but it gets the idea across. So from merchants to politicians to sailors and soldiers, shared drinking practices held together white society in the Leeward Islands. Formal political structures and interpersonal trade alike relied on communal drinking. Some legislative bodies and courts in the early Caribbean met in taverns or public houses rather than in, or most legislative bodies and courts in the early Caribbean met in taverns or public houses rather than in purpose-designed buildings. Councilmen and governors viewed wine and punch as key to sustaining political debate. The pending arrival of a lieutenant governor and his retinue, or the scheduled sessions of a council and assembly required stocks of wine and liquor and other necessaries, even during times of war. For example, Governor Cotterton in particular mandated steady supplies of Madeira, leading the gentlemen of the assembly to anticipate his arrival by ordering half a dozen pipes before the commencement of government in Antigua in 1699. The sitting assembly imported additional wine to enjoy themselves. Within the Leeward Islands, invitations to private gatherings to eat and drink also allowed for behind-the-scenes consultations, most commonly used for routine yet essential matters of trade and sociality. As the movement against Daniel Park illustrated, well-lubricated feasts provided the space and condition for seditious political plotting. Alcohol proved a key tool of the chief conspirators, Mr. Edward Perry and Mr. Barry Tankard, when searching for a barrister to gather the charges against Park for presentation to the Crown. According to Park's response to those charges, they made, quote, feasts and gets men drunk and gets them to sign a paper they call articles against me without knowing one word of them, as several of them have confessed. Ironically, Park gained this confession by suggesting, quote, his friends got one of them drunk and asked him the principles he told them. In this instance, the Crown reprimanded those who slandered Park. Alcohol itself held no political allegiance and could be wielded as a powerful weapon for any cause in the Leeward Islands. Park's handling of a similar gathering proved to be one of the catalyzing events in the movement against him. In September 1708, Royal African Company agent Edward Chester hosted either, quote, a riot or a friendly gathering, depending on who you asked, in St. John's. Park disrupted his own evening at the coffee house to handle the matter. When he instructed those assembled at Chester's to, quote, drink quietly or disperse, they informed him that they were drinking in a friend's house and was time enough to go home. They then continued drinking and none of them offered to move from thence and seemed affronted at the general's civil message to them. Park sent in 2 constables to force his edict to disperse. According to Park, The men locked the officials inside the house. Several of them were jailed for inciting a riot, and all paid a fine unto Her Majesty in the current money of the island, ranging from £200 to £400, for a total amount of £2,900. Unsurprisingly, jailing some of Antigua's wealthiest residents generated controversy. Interpersonal sniping aside, the crux of the ensuing debate fell on the question of what sort of event Chester had hosted. They asked, were Chester and his friends engaging in a war room meeting fueled by drink, or just some friends sharing a gentlemanly bottle of wine? Alcohol's mutability within Leeward Island society made either option plausible enough to allow for partisan readings, increasing its utility as a political tool. Michael Ryan, the provost marshal, testified that the company had retreated to a Caleb Lasher's house and, quote, began to drink uncommon and indecent healths. After making their way to Chester's house, Chester, quote, went into the room and drank to one of the company. Other constables alleged that 14 to 16 men sat in an inner room drinking, and that they asserted that the liberty to drink a glass at a friend's house could not be infringed on. A more damning piece of evidence suggested that one planter had sent an enslaved boy attending him to collect his pistols, suggesting that he anticipated violence. Those charged continued to insist that they were just drinking in, quote, a quiet and peaceable manner. Edward Chester declared that Park constructed the whole event to make himself look more powerful. He argued that Park singled him out because 'twas glorious to come in with his armed men and his own sword drawn to disturb half a score of gentlemen drinking a bottle of wine at their friend's house. In response to questions regarding why he locked the constables in, Chester resorted to the favorite scapegoat of white men of his station, alleging that, quote, the Negro boys then in the house observing, without order from any person then in the house, went and shut the street door of the said house. Chester depicted himself as correcting the unthinking action of the boys he forced to observe his drinking party, and thus absolving himself of fault. Within the enslaved Black community, the tensions inherent to slaveholding societies of Leeward Islands came to a head across 1735 and 1736, when concerns over an island-wide rebellion of the enslaved convulsed Antigua. Labeling Court and Tomboy as the head of it, Esquire to the Council Robert Arbuthnot's suspicions regarding the extent of the planning were raised when he heard that, quote, Tomboy had a very sumptuous and public feast but the Sunday at his own master's house in St. John's, to which were invited a great number of slaves and that several white persons were spectators of it. Such a display of sociable consumption, hosted by an enslaved man at his master's plantation, quote, appeared to the said Robert Arbuthnot to be very extraordinary. Arbuthnot set out to investigate. One of the remarkably consistent aspects of the conspiracy's progression, as it related by enslaved witnesses, were instances of ritualized drinking, conducting gatherings ranging from small dinner parties to expansive events boasting feasting and dancing, to gills of rum quaffed quickly on sanctioned trips into town. Such events, coupled with numerous instances of more casual consumption, give a sense of the opportunities for sociality and strategizing that Antigua's Black population carved out in the few non-laboring hours afforded to them. Some gatherings occurred on plantations while the white owner was absent, as a man named Tarcot's feasted. Although Tarcot himself initially claimed that he had only invited 8 people over to dine, multiple witnesses described a multi-ethnic gathering of over 40 enslaved and free people and a white couple. While the court claimed that all white inhabitants were to be murdered, a number of white people were present for a portion of these evenings. One witness described that there was, quote, 2 tables joined together and a great number of Creoles and Coromantese that dined there, and then went on to list a sumptuous feast, including a boiled course was served up first, and then a roast course. There were 2 dishes of almost every sort. There were fowls, 2 sorts of pies, turkeys boiled and roast pork, boiled and roast kid, and 3 sorts of puddings, boiled, baked, and custard. Women also attended many of these events, in addition to providing the organizational space and ritual materials required to enact insurgent politics. But the women's presence at these events gave them the appearance of more typical dances that enslaved people held in their meager free time, and therefore it helped to avoid undue suspicion from white observers. However, after eating, the women decamped to another location and the white couple left. Tarcot then, quote, brought in punch, sangria, and wine, and we drank. The more clandestine work of plotting could then begin. Valentine Morris, a prosecutor of these trials, best exemplified the heightened worries over the specter of enslaved people's excessive consumption at feasts. His insistence that they held their, quote, nightly cabals at almost half the plantations in the island, that they have their public feast at above 30 several places, and that at some of the feasts they had above 40 dishes of meat and second courses, all of much variety as the island affords, with all sorts of liquor, offers an exaggerated reading of the feasts and gatherings enslaved people hosted. However, his invective does illuminate the degree to which lavish consumption of food and liquor had become associated with a weak political and economic status in the Leeward Islands. If enslaved people had access to wines, liquors, and meats, all signifiers of economic and social importance, that left less to distinguish white elites and firmly refuted the commodifying logic that justified their enslavement. And here I wanted to just call attention briefly to the function of observers of drinking parties. So in each case, both the enslaved boys, Edward Chester made to attend him, and the white couple or white spectators detailed. Alcohol consumption allowed the participants in the act to assert a different and particular political agenda, not only claiming the space for their own use, but putting on a performance in each situation. So in addition to articulating political commitments and social status to each other, white drinkers performed a certain version of masculinity and control to the enslaved boys, men, and women they forced to attend them. Within the 1736 conspirators, the performance served a different function. Hosting Sunday meetings, funerals offered a thin veneer of respectability, or at least explanation, or it served to titillate a white audience made uncomfortable by a slave's assertion of their own humanity. Carving out space for conviviality, effective bonds, and mourning through these gatherings served to assert a different sort of social world than white spectators were comfortable with, but were also fascinated by. The conventions of these gatherings also masked their intended political purpose. Political networks and resistance could hide under displays of dancing and drinking. And this is from a later cartoon, but it gives a sense of sort of the exaggerated sense of racialized revelry, and then white spectators using it as their own form of entertainment. So I'm now going to talk about toasts and toasting, which formed another key alcohol practice in both white and Black communities. There's lots to say about interpersonal, religious, and merchant connections forged through toasting, but today I'm just going to talk briefly about mass politics and toasting's relationship to concepts of loyalty and political authority. My interpretation of toasting is a decipherable, meaningful articulation of political affiliation and intent is informed by the work of Angela McShane, Phil Withington, and Mark Halewood, in conversation with African diaspora and Caribbean scholars, Vincent Brown, Kwame Konadu, and Walter Rucker. So Leeward Ireland's governors took up Restoration era rituals of mass health drinking to remind imperial subjects of their position within larger structures of the empire's hierarchy. For example, when the French surrendered to Governor Christopher Codrington in August 1690, he, quote, took down the French and hoisted up the English flag, drank their majesties' healths with a round of all the guns in the fort, which was also answered by the frigates, and 3 volleys of the whole army, and spent the remainder of the day in expressions of joy suitable to the occasion. Similar events celebrated more formal matters of state. Upon the official birth of Great Britain with the Act of Union in 1707, the Nevisian treasurer purchased a hogshead of wine to be, quote, given to the regiment now in arms to give almighty thanks for the new nation. When King George II took the throne in 1727, 200 of the principal inhabitants of St. Christopher's gathered to sign orders of loyalty. The governor then relayed that the afternoon we were all engaged in drinking health and prosperity to His Majesty, the Queen, and all the royal family. Singular toasts also signaled an individual's politics. Faced with charges of self-interest and dislike for Antigua, Daniel Park's best defense proved to be attestations of him regularly engaging in the right sort of toasting. Joseph French, the then treasurer of Antigua, insisted that he, quote, positively remembered that at the said house, Park drank the prosperity of this island. French further explained that he hath attended the general at a great many entertainments in this island, both before the outgoing and since, and cannot remember that he ever omitted any one of their either drinking or expressing himself by wishing the prosperity thereof. Park himself declared his support for Antigua through detailing drinks, appealing to all the gentlemen and council with whom I ever keep company, if it has not constantly been my custom, after I drank the queen's, the prince's, and the duke's health, to drink the prosperity of this island. In fact, Park did this toast to Antigua so frequently that he risked making the inhabitants of the other islands jealous. Just as the nature and intent and practice of toasting took on a heightened resonance in the case of Park, a formalized oath draft designed to bind together those who imbibed to a common purpose and to each other came to be a focal point of Black conspirators' meetings. Swearing an oath to the effect of, quote, here is confusion and damnation to all those who will confess to be false, and that will not stand by and help kill or destroy the white people, man, woman, and child, stood at the center of the conspirators' ritual politics. Rum, punch, wine, beer, or cool drink formed the base, and additional oath ingredients of grave dirt and cock's blood were sometimes added. As two men questioned, Dick and Jemmy attested, however, common wine or punch by way of health without the oath ingredients was esteemed oath and binding. Jemmy qualified, while it might be binding, quote, the Negroes did not apprehend such terrible consequences from breaking it as when administered with grave dirt or cock's blood. Although not all of the enslaved who confessed to taking oath claimed Gold Coast extraction, many of them did. Others had been enslaved in Britain or in Spanish colonies for much, if not all, of their lives. The resonance with drinking French ceremonies with Khan-speaking people and with European health drinking are clear. Speaking to both traditions, but forging a third, the conspirators used the shared and ritualized consumption of alcohol to make political claims on the land they labored on and social claims on each other. Invoking confusion as a consequence for failing to execute the conspiracy or for turning a witness directly attacked these connections. Rather than feast sociability and political connections, alcohol could act as a conduit to social isolation and the confusion of one's social ties if the oath was violated. African and African-descended women and men drew on alcohol as the substance through which they articulated both the possibility of political and social futures and the risk of social obliteration, giving new meaning to the liquor produced through their forced labor. So the last area I'm going to look at briefly is the relationship of alcohol and movement through space. Colonial officials legislated limits on soldiers and sailors in an attempt to preserve morality under a guise of maintaining public health. In Nevis's 1705 Articles of War, which were re-implemented across the first half of the 18th century, the second article detailed that being, quote, found drunk on sentinel march or guard duty could draw the censure of the court-martial. Many islands passed legislation similar to Montserrat's 1724 Act to prevent the frequenting of taverns, alehouses, and other tippling houses by seamen, and for the preventing of selling rum, punch, and other strong liquors to Negroes on Sunday in the island of Montserrat, coupling what they felt to be potential sources of disorder together. Antiguan councillors heeded the concerns of naval officers, explaining that the inhabitants of our English harbor of selling rum and rum punch to the seamen, whereby their health had been greatly impaired, we think it would be of benefit to the public could a method be found for restraining them for the future. Whether health, hangovers, immorality, or desertion stood as the ultimate concern of the captains and legislators can only be intuited. Colonel Morris later complained that his soldiers in hospital were being, quote, constantly supplied with rum by the people of the said tenement to the very great prejudice of His Majesty's service. In this case, they removed the tenement rather than attempt to legislate invalid troops' consumption. Park himself invested an unusual amount of personal attention and political capital into similar concerns. After receiving complaints regarding the soldiers, Park, quote, gave out orders that the fantone should be beat every night at 8 o'clock, and if any soldier was found in the punch house or out of his quarters at that time, he should be sent to the guard and punished, not published. Dissatisfied with the application of his orders, Park soon took to patrolling alongside his constables. These evening walks did not endear him to the lower status white men in the colony. His true transgression, however, was trying to control the social and political drinking and congregating of other members of the white elite. In a letter Park wrote to defend his patrol, as he reported, I was by this means not only a terror to the soldiers, but to the idle drunk inhabitants. Many members of the elite embraced attempts to limit excessive alcohol consumption among those they perceived as potentially disruptive to the hierarchies of race, class, and religion that they dominated. When similar measures were redirected towards them, they viewed it as an impingement on their right to freely associate. Enslaved men and women faced far more limits on their ability to move through the colony. As Stephanie Camp, Marisa Fuentes, and Catherine McKittrick have demonstrated, however, colonial officials and white enslavers could not completely eliminate the possibility of rival geographies. In addition to feasts and dinners, enslaved conspirators took advantage of other forms of permitted movement in order to exchange and consume alcohol in the service of their political practices. Men traded illicitly gotten rum for even more illicit stores of powder and supplies. A woman named Cuba hid powder disguised in empty liquor bottles in her home. And Tamboy's wife, Luzetta, planned to act as a messenger on the day of the King's Ball, which was involved in the plot they were planning to blow up the King's Ball in order to enact their plot to coordinate the branches of the assault. After all, an enslaved woman moving across town on a day with an extravagant dress for white attendees would be assumed to be on a related errand, not participating in the rebellion. Women and the interpersonal connections they fostered also offered a means to mitigate some of the shattering effects of social transience caused by death, forced sale, or relocation, as well as some of the distrust sowed by the punitive colonial state. So to conclude, while alcohol served many functions in the Caribbean, both enslaved people and white men used alcohol to articulate and reinforce politics and to shape and resist the colonial state and the fractious society of the early Leeward Islands. While I've pointed to three important areas of thematic overlap, feasting, toasting, and movement, there remains a key difference that emerges when the Park murder in 1710 and the 1736 trials are considered together. Those prosecuted in 1736 were horribly punished, faced increased restrictions on their consumption, and all of the social and political connections that accompanied it. White men remained in positions of power and ultimately went unchallenged. No one was prosecuted for murdering a sitting governor. Enslavers understood the challenge enslaved people's claiming of alcohol and the spaces of political negotiation it created posed to their control of the Leeward Islands, and therefore made every effort to reduce the alcohol enslaved people produced, carted, and served to a tool of commodification. They also attempted to preserve alcohol's potent exchange value for themselves. Doing so required legislatively and ideologically constructing Black and Indigenous consumption as vicious, conniving, disordered, and illogical. Though white elites relied on many forms of alcohol, whether exchanged or consumed, to fuel their own political and social structures, they deemed Black practices supported by alcohol duplicitous and intoxicating, and therefore beyond the realm of what could be rightly called politics at all.